Ladies and gentlemen, hello, welcome back once more to Professor Drew's Lab. This week we are going to be doing a little bit of a change from the norm. A lot of the questions today are more in the advice spectrum than typical lab videos. So not so many direct questions about the campaign, a lot more just in general running the game stuff. There will, by proxy, need to be another spoiler warning here for specifically session 98. But in general, just a good idea. If you're not fully caught up, I will try to put some tags before any questions that might tap into some big spoiler stuff. But in general, a lot of the questions today are just how to run the game, how do I make NPCs, how do I balance RP and combat and stuff. But we'll get into that in a second. I just want to give everybody a chance if you're not all the way caught up and you don't want to risk it. Go ahead and bounce on out of here. Come on back when you are all caught up. But I think I have stalled long enough for everybody to decide if this video is for them or not. So let's jump right on into it. We are going to start things off with Reptile Xeno over on the YouTube side. Reptile Xeno says, here is a DM-based question. I'm going to be starting my first big campaign soon, but I was wondering how you keep your NPCs varied and interesting without relying on their descriptions, and how do you keep a good balance between roleplay and combat, all the while making both interesting, especially if members of your group only like one of those aspects. I've had this problem since I started DMing after watching the Tots journey. So, two phenomenal questions to start us off. Well done, you. I'm going to split this one up into parts. We're going to start with how do you keep NPCs interesting or varied without just describing them. And the immediate gut reaction answer that I'm going to throw out to you is I don't necessarily think you have to do that. It's just something that I find enjoyable when I'm running my games. But I'm also very much inspired by Brennan Lee Mulligan, obviously Matt Mercer, Matthew Colville, all of these lovely, lovely folks that are the ones that I learned to play D&D from, so I always thought that was just the way you have to do it. I have since learned and played in games where the DM doesn't ever really talk in character for the NPCs. They just tell you the intent of what they're saying, and they do just sort of describe very well how that person thinks, feels, and talks to you in that moment. And that can be just as engaging, and it can also be a lot clearer for you and the player, because when you're having those interactions, if there's no sort of veil where the DM has to act and also be considering those things, a lot less information gets lost in translation. Everything is a lot clearer. So I don't think you necessarily have to do that. But it's also important to remember, I include myself in this, by the way, I'm not trying to hype myself up. Not every DM out there is a professional voice actor or an author or a comedian. And trying to force yourself to do all of those things just because you're DMing is an unnecessary stressor for what's already a pretty difficult thing, especially when you're just starting out. So the best way to make your NPCs unique is just make them memorable. So the way that I do that might be a crazy voice or have them kind of look distinct so that the players will be encouraged to go talk to them. But that doesn't always work. Sometimes there's that old adage that somebody tweeted at Matt Mercer, and they're like, yeah, you see the warlock, he's sitting at the bar and he's got like horns and all this like this dark robes and armor going on, and he's got this flaming sword. And the players go, well, who else is at the bar? And you're like, well, there's a goblin. No, like, I want to go talk to the goblin. What's the goblin's name? And you're like, Boblin. And now you're stuck. So the players will kind of decide for you which one of your NPCs is memorable. My favorite sort of joke answer is Gil, just because it was so early on. Everybody always wants to know what Gil's doing. How's Gil? We battled with Gil like 2, maybe 3 times in the first 10 sessions. But he stuck. He was memorable just because. Cassius the Gaseous, He'll follow me forever. But Gil is not a particularly distinctive NPC. He just, he was just one of the early battles that they had, so they'll remember that. So as for how do you keep your NPCs interesting or varied without just describing them, your players will kind of do that for you. But in the sort of NPC design space, I do a lot of stuff usually with the Team Rocket leads, where they all have like wild hair, or they're sort of portly and they dress like a bumblebee. You just have fun with it. You have to determine when you're making your NPC, is this going to be somebody who's funny in the sense that like they look a little bit off and maybe they're a bit goofy? Are they a little creepy? Are they off-putting? Do they just sort of make people uncomfortable? And once you've figured out what you want out of that NPC, that will help you kind of find their little niche. And if you're the kind of DM that's like me and you love to throw a little accent on a lot of your NPCs, you just kind of figure out how they would talk. If you want to go that route and you have players like I do, like the Tots, they're going to ask you where they're from, because they're going to want to know where is that accent from, if it's in the same region or continent of your world. If you're doing a traditional fantasy setting, and they're gonna want to know like, oh, are all of your dwarves, traditional stage Scottish? Not necessarily. They don't have to be. But if that's something that you want to do, you have to make sure that you stick with that. So that's my advice for NPCs, because I could probably go on for like an hour and a half on how I've done NPCs in the past, but actionable advice is what we're looking for here. So don't force yourself to do things that you're not comfortable with, but there's nothing wrong with kind of stretching your own boundaries and kind of growing as a DM, especially early on. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Make your NPCs weird and goofy and a little bit wacky. Just be prepared that your players are going to have questions that you maybe don't have answers for, which is going to teach you that sort of improv mechanic that you'll have to get really good at. So that's my advice for NPCs. Now, how do you keep a good balance of RP and combat? So I will not speak on behalf of all the players, especially not all of mine, but definitely not just in general. But I've had a few talks with my players, both at the table and away from it. And we've said in a few places before, I'm not a huge combat guy in D&D, both as a player and a DM. I understand it's necessary for the game. I'm never mad when it's time to like roll for initiative, but it does bog the game down, and there's not really a way that I've found to make it faster in the moment. Obviously, in the edits, I can fix it, which is great. In the sessions, I can keep combat punchy, because I can cut out, the 15-minute rules discussions, and I've always heard the old adage that combat in D&D is 45 minutes of fun stuffed into 5 hours. And that's kind of how I view combat. But I'm running a Pokemon DnD. There's going to be combat. Every combat has now become mass combat. The best way to do it is to just keep things moving. But a couple of my players are not a fan of combat, and a couple of them live for it and hate the RP aspect. So you do need to find a good balance, and it's very difficult. It's very personal. That balance is going to be different for every player. I'm not going to call anybody out specifically, but I'm sure eagle-eyed observers, when you're watching the sessions, you can tell who does and doesn't really care about combat versus who does and doesn't really care about sort of heavy RP character development stuff. It's hard. It's hard when you're not involved in something, or especially if you're in combat and your rolls are just not going well. That happened to me a few nights back. I was playing in somebody's game off camera, and I just could not roll above a 7 in a combat, and it's really hard to stay engaged. When you wait, 15 minutes, you take your turn, you roll your 1 die, and you roll like a 2, and you're like, okay, I guess I do nothing. It's hard to not get discouraged. So for someone like me who already is not a huge fan of a combat, you get thrust into a mass combat and then you're not hitting, it can be frustrating. But I also really enjoy the RP aspect that can happen in combat, because you start to theme those failures or your successes into how would my character react in this moment. And you get a lot of sort of emergent gameplay, and you can do that with your DM, you can do that with the other players. So that's a way to keep your RP-focused people engaged in a combat, is give them something that they can work with. It is a lot of improv. It's a lot of yes and. Obviously, that's just sort of in the nature of the game. So you kind of just lean into it. If you're in a combat and you've got a couple players that don't really care, give them something that they can bounce with. If they try to interact with your bad guys, give them some dialogue, you know? That's a super easy way to fix things. Start describing a few extra details about the people that they're fighting in the moment. This is a little bit harder to do with Pokemon if they're sort of, you know, your vanilla-esque. If I'm not doing a variant of a Pokemon, if it's just, you know, if it's a Bulbasaur and it's just totally normal, it can be a little hard to throw in some details, but you can always do something. You can throw in like, oh, they've got some scarring, and then your RP players might be wondering, okay, well, why is there scarring there? Are there trappers in the area? And they'll make their own fun out of that. You just give them the tools, let them put it together. Even if it doesn't go anywhere, it'll keep them engaged through the combat. Now that's the part I find easy, is keeping the RP characters a little more engaged in a combat. The hard part is keeping the combat-focused players engaged when there's no combat going on. That is so difficult. It's very difficult, because if they're not involved and they're not rolling dice and they're not using all of their cool fun abilities that they have, they really don't have a reason to stay engaged if they're not there for everybody else's story. So it's hard when you have a player, especially if they have like main character syndrome. Mercifully, none of the tots do, so nobody's like jumping in over anybody else and saying like, oh, well, I would have done this, so let me be involved. If you've got players that just want to roll dice and they just want to hit stuff, you know, they get called a lot of names. They get called murder hobo and, you know, a million other things. But it's really hard. That's the best way I can sum up this question, is it's exceptionally difficult to keep a combat-focused player engaged in an RP session when they are not the focus. My best advice, and it's something that I've tried in the past and I'll probably try in the future, is when you've got those players that kind of just check out, throw something at them. When you see them kind of zoning out, force them to be involved somehow. Ask them how they're feeling in that moment. Get them engaged. You don't want to make them uncomfortable, because some players are just not really there for the RP aspect of it. They might even, you know, they could describe their character's actions in third person. I see nothing wrong with that. And it also does kind of irk me when I see players giving each other a hard time for never speaking in character. That's totally fine. That's not everybody's bag of chips. I get it. Not everybody's a theater kid. It's totally fine, but you still want to play the game. So when you've got those combat-focused players and they get that glazed eye, maybe the phone comes out, you know, they start, you know, they pull up YouTube or whatever they're doing in the corner of your table, you just throw something at them in that moment that forces them to kind of engage. So keep them on their toes. Maybe have that, if there's a conversation going on with an NPC and another player and they're in that room, have that NPC, you know, start talking to them. Try to bring them into that moment. It's a lot more difficult in an RP setting because sometimes they're not even, you know, the character's not in the room. In those moments, I'll lax it up. I'll let them just kind of do their own thing. But you can always jump over to keep somebody engaged and say, okay, what are you doing while this is happening? So finding a good split of your time is something you can do. I do that a lot with the tots. Is if somebody's had the spotlight for about 15 minutes and everybody else is kind of glazing over, I go, okay, what's everybody else doing? We're going to jump back to this in a bit. And most of the time when that player's had that much time in the spotlight, they might want time to catch up on their notes and write everything down and make sure that they're understanding stuff and formulate some more questions for when that conversation continues. So balancing your time is something that you'll get better at the longer that you DM, and that'll help you find a good balance of RP and combat. A good rule of thumb is to try to have, you know, depending on the length of the session, I try to have 3 to 5 encounters ready, but an encounter does not need to be combat. You just need something that's going to pop up, maybe 2 weird NPCs that they might interact with for like an hour or 2 each, and then maybe a combat that they could get into if they want. That's my usual rule of thumb for the TOTS, is to have 2 encounters that could go one way or another. They might be neutral at first, and it could turn into, a battle. It could turn into them being pals. You just never know. And then have one thing that absolutely is starting as a combat that they could get out of if they don't want to fight. And I think part of that as a DM is you just have to be okay with letting an encounter go. That's the easiest way I can tell you. If all of your players don't like combat, put more emphasis and more work into the encounters that aren't meant to be a combat. And the ones that are meant to be a combat can just be, okay, orcs attack, and there's 3 of them. It'll be nice and punchy. They get to use some of their combat abilities, and then we're back to the action that they care about. And vice versa. If you've got the players that really want to do combat stuff, then maybe don't present them with an NPC that's like, hey, I really want you to do this sort of kingdom espionage, and I don't want you to get spotted. They might just completely tune out and be like, nah, I stabbed this guy. So you just have to know your party. You have to know what they want. Talk to your players. That's the easiest way to figure out where everybody's at on this scale. How often do you want to combat on a scale of 1 to 10? And just try to find an average, because you're not gonna make every session a knockout session for every player every time. It's not gonna happen. It's impossible. If you could do that, the stakes would just be raised constantly, and you would eventually, like, in order to just get through a session, the players would be solving world-ending crises left, right, and center. So unless that's the kind of game you're going for, just set expectations, talk with your party. But hopefully that kind of helps with the questions that you had for us. Let's jump on down. Gianmarco Coronel has some questions about the tone of the TOTS game. Did you try to make Pokemon a dark fantasy, or are you trying to make it more happy? Lately, it seems to be heading to the dark fantasy and not a happy one. I've talked a lot before about the tonal whiplash of the TOTS campaign. My goal from the start was never to do a gruesome, gritty, dark fantasy dungeon crawl or a death battle simulator, but I also knew I didn't want to stay 100% true to the source material. I wanted to run Pokemon DnD because I knew the players would enjoy it, and they would get more out of it than I did. So I knew I didn't want a trainer battle simulator where you walk around and you battle and you murder hobos and you're rewarded for it and you just get money. I knew I wanted to tell a story that was bigger than just the kids, but also if they didn't want to get involved, we would just sort of pivot and figure it out, maybe do some small town stuff. Totally fine. Didn't matter. So what I wanted to do was throw away the stuff that I knew I wouldn't like and add in bits that would keep me engaged, because if you're a DM, especially a new one, try to remember your goal is to let the players have fun, but you need to enjoy it too. If you don't enjoy it, you're gonna get burnout and it's gonna be ugly. It's happened to me twice throughout the course of the TOTS campaign where I've just hit a wall and you get crazy writer's block and there's not a way for you to make things fun and exciting. And it just seems like impossible to keep going. So those are the moments where I'll throw something weird into the game. That's where these sort of runes came from. I needed a way to keep things fun. So I was like, you know what? This'll intrigue the players for a bit. Obviously, everything that's happened from then on has been a little bit wacky. But a lot of the times, if you hit those moments where you're like, okay, I know I don't want to do this, but I want to keep the players engaged, throw something weird, introduce magic into a non-magical setting, that usually does it. Keep it reasonable, otherwise throw a variant Pokemon at them. But I knew I didn't want a dungeon crawl, I didn't want a battle simulator, and I know that's pretty much what the Pokemon games are. But I wanted to give the players an experience, and by proxy, you lovely folks at home, I wanted to give everybody a chance to see that Pokemon doesn't have to be that. Because if you go into the Alluvia gym and it's just a battle slog, that kind of sets the tone for the entire game. Okay, I'm gonna go in here, I'm just gonna roll dice, we're gonna do combat over and over and over again, and that'll get really stale really, really fast. So if you walk in there and they say, okay, we're going to have a race, you're like, oh, snap, this can be different. And it got the players thinking. It clicked a couple gears in their brain, and they said, okay, this game doesn't have to be, I go in here and I fight and I move on. And then I go in here and I fight and I move on. And that's what I was going for. So as soon as that landed, I was like, okay, we're going to be okay. We're going to be fine. I've talked in a few prior videos about sitting down, making a bunch of encounters that were all very silly and lighthearted, and they just don't land. They just didn't land well. So we had a couple of those. We had like Gil, all those fun encounters at like Oriander Cities, Pokemon Center. And that's kind of the last time the kids really just sought out battles for fun, at least in mass. They have done it a few times in, like, I think Xantha, right around the time that Milo caught Bullet. I'm probably mixing up my cities here, but it has been like 3 or 4 years now. But I wanted okay, let me collect my thoughts for a moment. I had about 4 ways from the beginning that I thought the game would or could go. And they were on a different spectrum of how lighthearted could the game be versus how dangerous and dark can the game be. I'm not going to tell you what those were, but you can kind of extrapolate based on the tonal whiplash of the game. There has always been a moment every now and again where the tots could pull the ripcord on a plot line that they're in, and they could go do something else. But that doesn't mean that other plot hook will just go away. So you can't solve every problem, and the ones that you don't solve, especially those darker ones, are gonna make the world more dangerous and more gritty. So I've tried to keep that scale balanced enough in the terms of what the players have a choice to do, so that they don't feel compelled to solve every problem, because that's also part of D&D. If they wanted to just battle other trainers, world events would just play out as they do, and people would solve them or not. And then, out of nowhere, suddenly there's all these issues going on, and they've just been running around having fun battles. It's the same deal in any sort of RPG. You run around, you do a bunch of side quests, and then you're either way over leveled for the main story, or if the main story kind of levels up with you, you're in Skyrim, and you go do the first like Stormcloak mission, and you're level 70. The game sort of scales with you, So I wanted to try to keep that involved, because again, this is the first campaign for the players, so I didn't want to make it super, super dark right out of the gate. But they seem to engage a little bit more when the plot hooks are more deadly, and when they are a little more dangerous. So that's the route that we've kind of leaned on. So yeah, you are right. We were trying to keep a middle ground, but lately it has been going to a more sort of dark fantasy place, and I'm kind of here for it. It's very engaging. But hopefully that sort of answers your question. We're gonna jump on down to D-Swag for what have been some of the most exciting or memorable moments of this campaign. I know my 3, and they're all fairly early on, so you don't really have to worry about spoilers for this question. Critical Stick was a big moment, because that was the first notable natural 20, where the players are like, oh my god, we crit, something crazy happened. I did 2 damage and it was relatively minor, but oh man, this is awesome. And they got that first hit of dopamine when they rolled their first crit. That was awesome. That was great. That was the first time I saw the players really just roar in excitement at something that somebody else did. So I love those moments. Alluvia Gym, we talked about a little bit just a couple minutes ago, but that was big because that was when the players realized we weren't doing source material stuff, and that they could stretch the bounds. And I'm going to tie in that to the first Rite of Learning, when I handed the reins over to the players and said, okay, what do you want to teach your team? And they were like, oh man, I don't even have to pick a move that exists. This is great. So that was really fun for me. And then the Ghost Trio in Xantha. That was big. I've probably said it before, but my biggest campaign regret was not letting them try to catch one of those skeletons or ghosts, because that would have been so fun. That would have been so fun early on, and I regretted saying no as soon as I said it, but I didn't want to go back on it. But yeah, those are my memorable moments, but that is something that I regret. D-Swag, you have another question. Are there any in-game mini games that you would have wanted to implement? Not really, but in fairness, that's mostly out of ignorance on my part. So a lot of the times we'll roll something out and a session will come out and the comments will be like, oh man, this is like that one episode from this one show, or it's like, oh, it's this moment from like Diamond and Pearl or Black and White, and I haven't played those really, and I haven't watched the show that much. Like, the game is based off like gold and silver pretty much. Like, that's kind of where we're at. So a lot of the in-game mini games I'm familiar with are like, hey, let's make what are those little cupcakes, like the puffins, or like Ruby and Sapphire when you make the little treats for your team to do better in contests. I've played like some Coliseum and stuff, so it's kind of hard to say, but a lot of the fun moments that we've come up with have just been a way to kind of spice things up and do different stuff with dice than just combat and skill checks. So, I should probably look into those, because I'm sure there's probably at least a couple that would be really fun to bring in. But that's a good question. You made me think about something I haven't thought about before. Switching gears for a sec, we are going to talk about Guerra Moxie's question. When you create regional variants like Chester, is their typing based off places of interest around the area that they are found? It's not always like a specific place of interest. Usually it is just environmentally based. For anybody that's watched the world building streams, I always talk about the Dale Kingsmill method of creating a town, where you do the social, the political, the economic and environmental, the religious, and the military structure of any place that you're building. Because if you can figure out those 5 to 6 things, depending on how you split it up, you can build pretty much any town from the ground up and know everything you need to know to run the game in there. So a lot of the times when I have a variant specifically like Chester, there are sort of plot hooks in that area that the players just haven't really bit at. And yeah, there are some interesting things going on in that region that we just haven't touched on, and that's totally fine. But a lot of the regional variants that'll happen like that, they will happen for a reason. It's not always a specific place. Sometimes there's an event that's happened in the past that I just want to start to introduce organically. But yeah, pretty much the short answer is like, it's not always a point of interest, but yeah, most variants are deployed for a specific reason. And then jumping on down, this is the sort of very, very meaty part of this video, and I know we're already like 30 minutes in or something. I don't know what it'll cut down to, but we've got some deep cutting questions from D-Swag, and then we're going to jump over to the Discord and talk about this. I'll tell you guys right now, this lab video is not going to have a Pokemon build at the end, because we might push a little over an hour. But here we go. D-Swag, you've got some deep cut questions. Not sure if this is something you have to deal with at all, but if you do, how do you prevent DM resentment for things that players didn't realize they were closing a door to? I.e., Manny's choice of a door or a weapon. So DM resentment is something that's very, very difficult to deal with. I've only seen it a few times, and it never feels good on either side. It's bad when you're the one that resents the DM's actions, and it's bad when you're the DM and a player gets mad at you for something that happened because of what they did. So it's hard because the players don't have all the answers, and you want to tell them everything, but you can't because that's the game. So I don't know that the example given in your question is necessarily a case of DM resentment. I haven't talked with Ben about that moment specifically, so I won't talk about this question in that regard. So I'm not really sure. It may be a case of that, but it is definitely a thing that you have to do when you're DMing. You say, do you pick option A or option B, and they go, I pick option A, and you go, okay, well, option B's gone forever. And it's a case of your actions have consequences. And if you could look at your life in the scope of like a D&D game, which is, sure, be an exercise you could do, we'll do it right now. If you have 2 job opportunities and you take option A, that's going to open a lot of doors for you, but it's going to close a lot as well. As soon as you close off option B, every branch decision you could have made from there is now closed to you because you didn't go that way. So if you have, the choice between, let's talk about the one scene of Kingdom Hearts I know about. You walk in the beginning, you're in that like stained glass circle, and they're like, okay, do you want a sword, a shield, or a staff? And you pick 2, and then the other one's gone. You don't hate the game for that. You made your choice. But it's different when it's a DM telling you something, because you might feel like they misled you or you misunderstood, and that could lead to a bit of resentment. So how do I deal with it, or how do you prevent it? I don't know that you can prevent it. As for how do you deal with it, if a player gets really, really upset, you just lift the screen up a little bit, metaphorically speaking. Take down the wall that's built up in front of you to say, hey, person to person, are you doing okay with that decision? If you're not, if you're not filming your game and you don't have to worry about continuity, just retcon something if they're really that upset. Let them kind of backpedal the decision, or maybe just be lenient on the rules for it. If they misunderstand a spell and you just leap on the chance to punish them for it, that would lead to some DM resentment for sure, because your character in theory would have known things that you can't know. And I think that's something that DMs need to sort of lighten up on, and that'll probably help you with some DM resentment. When your players make a mistake or they forget something because it's been like 3 weeks since they last played, go easy on them. It's your world, and they're engaged in the moment, but if they go away for a week or 2, they go back to their lives and their family and their job, and they're working, and they got all the normal stress of life. They go get their car serviced, whatever. They come back and they play again, and they forgot this one thing that you told them. Don't punish them for it. You don't necessarily have to be like, oh, well, remember, I told you this thing. You could tie it to a roll if you want to, but that's also on your players to kind of take notes. So that's where some resentment can come from the DM, is if you've got a player like, I'm not putting you on blast, Jordan, but if you got somebody like CJ who doesn't take notes because CJ wouldn't, and if CJ forgets something and doesn't act on that information, then Jordan's not worried about it. So I don't resent that decision, and Jordan doesn't get upset when he forgets something that he didn't write down. So there's no resentment there, But that's usually the point where I see DM resentment. I notice it a lot more when I'm a player and I see another player getting upset at something. It's usually a case where they messed up and the DM kind of used it as an opportunity to jump on them. Be like, oh, well, you should have taken better notes because your ability doesn't do the thing you thought it did, so you messed up, and now, you didn't read the radius of fireball, or you didn't read the specifics of like gaseous form, and now you're stuck in a wall, and now your character's gonna die, or whatever horrible situation you land in. So that's where I see DM resentment, and it sucks. It sucks a lot. But there's been a couple moments, especially in the more recent sessions, I would say probably from like 80 upwards. The most notable probably being from, I'd have to pull up the session lists, and in fact I think I'll do just that, but it's somewhere around like 87. A lot of you guys know you have a lot of questions about this, so if you're not all caught up, we've talked about it before in past live videos, etc. The tombstone. That's probably where this question is growing from. But the decisions for for that tend to cause problems. And there's another one from 98. So if you're not caught up on 98, you had the warning at the beginning. Here's another one right now. CJ opening up that box, giving up his eternity to get his friends back out of that box. And that's something Jordan didn't know, and it is caused by what we're going to talk about in a second. So that bit of resentment, there's a little line at the intro to 99 where Jordan says, I wish I had known what that was doing. And that, I don't know that it's necessarily DM resentment. Again, Jordan, I'm not trying to put you on blast, homie. Got nothing but love for you, brother. But that's a moment that when I was editing, I caught and didn't catch it in the session. So I caught it a couple weeks later. But it's definitely a case of none of the tots had all the answers in that moment. And they really wanted to solve this problem as fast as possible. So rather than sort of engage with the riddle and the puzzle that was put in front of them, they just started making leaps in logic, and they took a jump and they just went for something and they did it. So let's talk about the next question, which is player and character knowledge. So player and character knowledge are things that come up a lot. It's a very taboo term to start talking about metagaming. I know a lot of people, kind of cringe when that gets brought up, and they're like, oh, I think it's the worst thing a player can do is metagame. And I'm like, you're metagaming from the moment your character decides to go into a dungeon full of bugbears. Like, no one in their right mind is going down there, but you, the player, are making a decision. Hey, this is where the game is. This is where the treasure is, the rewards, the combat. This is where the story's going to be. My character's going to go down there. Right? Like, nobody's going to do that. You're metagaming from the moment you write your backstory. So I don't see a problem with it if it doesn't directly sort of ruin either a plot hook or specifically somebody else's good time. So if you're metagaming to like ruin someone else's fun, that's where I have a problem with it. If you metagame to try to keep things moving, then it is what it is. I'm a pretty easygoing DM, but there is a moment that I would like to talk about. I need to preface this again to my players. There's no bad blood here. I'm not trying to call anybody out. But session 98 and 99, there's an arc that I had set up that I thought would be super fun. And metagaming basically reduced it to like 5 seconds. And it kind of ties into that little discussion we had about opening that box. So again, disclaimer for the players, we haven't talked about this. It's okay. Nobody's in trouble. I'm not mad at anybody. This is a good time to discuss something like this. So players, if you're watching, just chill out. It's okay. You're not in trouble. So we have this run up, right? Everybody's in a box. The box is outside in the manor. Nobody saw anybody go in there. It's just a box. They were all inside. They were all in the kitchen in the manor. Nobody knew what happened. You've got 68 Pokemon running around this manor. All of them are beat up. Most of them are unconscious. And the dust is settling. So I set up an opportunity for the players to have time to unpack that trauma slowly but surely, and then realize that some of their friends are missing, right? But I wanted them to have time in character to discover that and build up to it together. And big shout out to Tia. Phoebe was like, all right, I go into our little triage center in the kitchen. I find all the teammates that I can. I make sure everybody's getting healed up. And Ruby's in there making a list. Missing in action. Wounded. You got... Put 70 of your closest friends in a room and then try to tell me where any one particular friend is at any given time, right? It's difficult. It would be exceptionally difficult. Couple that in with most of them are like, you're trying to find like one friend wearing like a specific shirt and it's foggy in there and you have a headache. Like that's kind of where we're at, right? So that was the tone I was going for that moment, was let's have that calm after the storm, right? You've got somebody walking through the burning rubble of the destroyed city, and they're trying to find that needle in the haystack feel, right? They're disoriented, they're tired, they have no idea what's happening. They're healing up everybody that's coming in, and I wanted that. I don't want to call it a cool moment, but it's a bit dramatic, where you're looking for those specific friends. You've got D who's running around and looking for Haka. You've got Bentley looking for Dragon and Huntail and Manny. And they're running around. And Manny, I know, is a whole other thing. Don't worry about it. But you've got all these kids that have just gone through like one of the most horrific battles in the history of the world. And there's just trauma all around them. And I've got Milo asking the grave tender, hey, what happened? What the heck is going on? How did this occur? And he's getting little pieces of the puzzle. And you've got Phoebe running the triage center saying, okay, who's missing? Who do we need to find still? Who's unaccounted for? And it's only been like 2 minutes since this battle wrapped up, but everybody wants to get a jump on healing. You've got Bentley kind of trying to console Manny. You've got CJ, who was just in space for 15 years or however long, and he's basically like a corpse. And you've got D looking around for Haka, trying to figure out what happened. He's frustrated with the other tots. So you've got this whole melting pot of trauma. And CJ has the riddle to open the box. And what I was really hoping is we'd have a long discussion for the players. Hey, do we know how to open this? And the grave tender's like, I don't know the spell to do it. So they could take that piece of the puzzle, take it to CJ. Okay, you have this thing. Let's write it out. Let's figure out what this could mean, what it might do. You've got D trying to break open the box and nothing's working. And then they would figure out through discussing with the grave tender and each other, okay, this is going to open the box, but these are the consequences for it. And then, do they draw straws? Do they have that conversation? Hey, who's giving up this eternity? This all gets circumvented by meta knowledge. All the players knew exactly where their team were. They knew exactly who was missing from their team. So we did miss out on this. I keep wanting to call it fun and cool, but I don't mean that. I mean like engaging, Fun in the sense of like, it's the emergent gameplay. It's the theme of the session. So anytime I say fun or cool in this moment, I'm not saying, hey, isn't it awesome all the trauma they went through? But I wanted that moment for everybody to go through and bond with the teammates that are left, the ones that survived, that haven't really seen life or death combat, maybe since Xantha, maybe ever. And out of nowhere, they saw like swaths of their friends getting cut down. They're seeing like eldritch abominations happening. There's ghosts all around them. There was a genuine threat of death, and we did lose somebody. So you've got all of that emotion built up, and it gets circumvented in about 2 minutes by D grabs the box because they know it's out there. Again, my players, my homies, my friends and family, I'm not calling you out. We're just discussing what happened in a sense of meta knowledge. And this is from a DM who's genuinely pretty okay with metagaming. It doesn't bother me as much as it does other DMs. But you got D who walks out, grabs a box, says, they're in here, I want him back. You've got Ben who has Manny point to the box when Manny should, in theory, be a bit inconsolable in the moment. But again, it's totally okay. He says, I think they're in there. Because in my head at that moment, we can still have this discussion. And then my boy Jordan, CJ, never changed, buddy. Here's, oh, hey, there might be something that can open it. Oh, I've got these words in my brain. Let me say them. Because I know Jordan in that moment knew, hey, this is probably the solution. But they hadn't had any player discussion of like, okay, what might happen when we do this? What does it look like when our friends come back? So we skipped a little bit of the unpacking of trauma here because player knowledge superseded character knowledge. And again, for some viewers at home that might have bothered you, for some DMs that might have really irked you, I'm kind of okay with it because, again, you got to be all right with some of your plot hooks just sort of going away. So I sort of had intended for that moment to be a 2 or 3 session trauma unpack and give them a chance to talk with their team about what they saw, deal with it, and all the while have this box just looming in the manor, not knowing what it's doing, not knowing where their friends are, could it activate again, kind of have that time bomb feel, you know? So we lost out on that big moment, and it's recent, and it was very difficult in the moment not to, as a DM, step in and be like, hey guys, come on, like, can we, like, this is kind of what's happening. But I didn't want to just tear down the veil because they were having a player discussion in character. So a lot of the times when you're unsure about something as a DM, you just keep your mouth shut and let the players do their thing. They solved what was meant to be like a really perplexing deal with a big moral discussion. They solved it really quickly, and we moved on, and now we have to deal with the consequences. But because of that meta knowledge, which could have caused resentment from me to the players, it led to a moment with a bit of resentment from the players to me. So they get their friends back, but at what cost? You know, CJ no longer has an afterlife. So there's now this big discussion of, okay, well, CJ didn't know he was giving that up, so why did you do that to me? But on the other hand, it's, well, if you guys had had a discussion in character, it would have been solved, right? So that's a moment that comes to mind for DM resentment in both ways. I wouldn't describe my feelings as resentment, a little more disappointment, which I know is usually worse, where it's like I'm not mad, I'm disappointed. I'm not disappointed in the players for their actions. I'm disappointed at the loss of like what could have been with that sort of plot thread. But again, I haven't talked to the players about that moment altogether. So I'm not going to say that like, oh, they totally resent me for this or this is how they feel about it. That's for them to decide. But that's a moment that comes to mind. When you mention DM resentment, that pops into my brain because I could see the players being frustrated in that moment, and I could see me or another DM in my shoes being resentful of the players for cheating is a rough word, but like kind of jumping the gun, you know, taking knowledge that they shouldn't have, making an illogical leap to something, and acting on information that they know but their character doesn't. Now, there's been plenty of moments in the game where the players had knowledge and the characters didn't, and it didn't cause any problems, and I usually will give out inspiration for that. If a player knowingly makes a bad call because the player knows something bad will happen to them, but the character could have no way of knowing, I will reward that because we only use carrots here, no sticks. No sticks, only carrots. But that's the big rant about like metagaming and DM resentment. And this whole video, by the way, quick shout out goes out to Garingo from the Discord. None of this video would have ever happened if you hadn't asked the question, where do you draw the lines for your players helping you produce things for the campaign? So planning and world building away from the table, because you were reluctant to let your players help so much so as not to spoil things. And we had a lovely discussion in the Discord. If you're in the Discord and you haven't seen it, it's in the Drew's Lab questions thread. You just got to scroll up a couple weeks. It's not too far up there. But we had a great discussion with all of the sort of Discord members. A lot of the DMs in there weighed in on this. And it's great and it's super healthy. But I want to talk about a couple of the examples here that I did in there for any of you that aren't in the Discord, that aren't through the Patreon. I don't want to exclude you guys from a good conversation. So we've talked in the past a lot, and by we I mean me and the players. Almost everybody has had maybe a dozen or so moments in the game that I've either set up with them away from the table. I might warn them, hey, I'm going to lob a moment up for X Pokemon on your team. The next time they're out, they might be getting a little close to something, or I have an arc in mind for them. So just be aware. Prime example is like the Sierras talk that we had in downtime. It was like, hey, this will probably happen if you want to do this. And then we have Manny walk up to Bentley. Ben knows this is coming, but it's still a moment that needs to happen. And I didn't want to just spring like, oh, by the way, you got to take a road trip now. So, derail what you were trying to do. The first example in the campaign of one of these moments was Crash's evolution. Jordan and I talked immediately after. It said, Croconaw is not the vibe. We don't want like a chubby gator. We want Crash to keep his sort of wild nature. So we had a discussion. We said, okay, what does he look like then if he evolves? Now, other DMs out there might have just taken the reins completely and said, no, I'll come up with something. I just sat with Jordan and said, okay, what do you want him to look like? Do you want to go like Velociraptor route? Are we going more like Gator-esque? Is he going to drop to all fours? And we went with the Velociraptor. And that was super cool because I didn't know what I wanted to do, but Jordan didn't want a normal Croconaw. So I said, let's figure this out together. Let's do it. And I don't think that's a problem. I think as a DM and a player, I think that's a very healthy thing for your game. If the players have a say in the world they're playing in, they'll be more invested. They'll be more likely to engage. We have moments like the Portelo gym with Titania jumping in. It's been a long time, but I'm trying to remember around when Milo had Titania for a while. He said, hey, I think the next time we go into a gym, Milo would never pick Titania for a gym, but she would pick herself. So there's going to be some cognitive dissonance going on where Milo's going to want to say no to Titania, but Joel wants Titania to want to join the fight. So he let me know, hey, there's going to be a moment where Titania is going to like disobey me and jump into a gym and kind of register herself. And I'm all for that. Because if you tell me as a player ahead of time, hey, I'm gonna start a thing and then basically get in an argument with myself, I don't want you to intervene and stop me. That's really helpful for me because you're just gonna confuse me. If you're like, hey, Titania's gonna jump into the fight, and then Milo's like, no, and I'm like, okay, are you just trying to set up like an RP moment? Because I'm here for you, but it ended up being a great decision for him because Titania went out, she had a great showing. And it was amazing, but it's something that Milo would never have done, but Joel thought would be a cool moment for Titania. I don't see that as cheating or a problem. D&D is a game about collaborative storytelling. It made for a memorable moment. Another good example of like letting the players help you build the world, Wadalonga. I've talked about it long enough. I don't think I have to say anything more than that. Wadalonga turned out great. Ambercrag, the Tots built pretty much all of Ambercrag with and for me. The ultimate example I can give you for this is when the players make a backstory that involves like a town that you didn't plan for or an organization that you didn't plan for. I don't see that as a problem. So why should their backstory stop being relevant and stop growing just because you started running the game? So I love building the world with the players, building plot hooks with the players, asking them constantly throughout the game, hey, what's your family like? I know we've talked about them in the backstory, but like really, who are they? And what does it look like when they're like at family dinner? What is that like? So asking those questions at and away from the table is a really healthy way to make sure that the game world keeps growing and is more vibrant and more alive, and also feels more engaging for those players when they can. One of my favorite things about the Wadalonga aspect and why I really want to do that more in the future is if the players can introduce a town or an NPC for you. That's great. I love those moments because it feels like two people talking about where they're from, and it doesn't at that moment feel like two player characters discussing a world that the DM has described to them. So I'm all for those moments, absolutely. Now, have those specific moments caused friction between players? Absolutely. Early in the game, a lot of my players didn't know that you could do that. So we had to have a big discussion at the table of, yeah, D&D is a collaborative storytelling experience. If you have a plot thread that you want to introduce for your character, or you want to have a new arc for something that you've come up with, absolutely you can do that. This isn't just me throwing a story at you and hoping that you bite and kind of go along with it. If you have a story idea that you want to tell for your character, I'm here for it, because that's the collaborative storytelling. If you come up with a plot hook for me, you've done my job for me, and that's awesome. I might tweak it a bit so that you don't have all the answers, but I'm not even mad if you as a player are like, oh no, this is that thing I told him about, or like, oh no, this plot hook that I came up with is happening. I better pretend not to know. No, it's fine. Like, if you know what it is, I'll probably even kick it to you and say like, hey, you know, how would this, you came up with this, what does this look like? Or I might have them describe something. If we walk into Wadalonga and Milo came up with the Cajun Crocodile and Ben designed Remy, I might, you know, in this day and age, I might say, you know, Ben, what does Remy look like? And Joel, why don't you describe the Cajun Crocodile? So that's a thing I've done in the past. I've done it in a few sessions coming up. So keep your eyes peeled for moments like that. But I do love making the players feel a little more engaged and kind of encouraging them to build the world for me in the moment. And work on those improv skills so that they get an understanding of what goes into prepping for a session. Because that encourages players to become DMs, and that means the game will keep going, you know? So this has been my incredibly long-winded DM advice slash taboo topics discussion. I would have no problem doing another one of these in the future. So if you guys have more, you know, just general DM advice, I'm more than happy to weigh in on those sort of things. We could do another one of these in the future. Again, this one did run a lot longer than intended, so we're not going to build a Pokemon in this one, so my apologies. But as always, gang, feel free to drop more questions, comments, clarifications. I'm curious how you guys would answer some of the questions that came up in here. If you are a part of the Discord, you can always drop your questions in the Drew's Lab section of the Discord, or you can drop them in the comments section down below, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. I'm trying to do a better job of organizing them, so that's why this episode's a little bit longer. I've just been kind of stockpiling questions like this. So I would love to do another one of these in the future if you guys have more question on advice or how to handle a certain thing, or you know, how rulings work, any of that kind of stuff. I'm more than happy to talk about that with you guys. But I've talked long enough today, so thank y'all very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one, and we'll see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.